Right, we are live. Um, happy, oh bloody hell, I've forgotten the day. Happy Monday, everyone. It's lovely to be here, and particularly lovely to be here with Daniel Pryor, an old friend of mine, and currently a research economist at the head of programs at the Adam Smith Institute. Um, so Dan's interested in a lot of things that I'm also interested in, like immigration reform and sex work. Um, not personally interested in that way. You know what I mean. Um, but Dan is here today to discuss drug policy, particularly drug policy in the UK. And I think, well, why don't you tell us a bit about your work more generally, and then we'll kind of get into the questions.
Yeah, sure. So, as you mentioned, I work for the Adam Smith Institute, which is a free market think tank. We call ourselves neoliberals rather than libertarians for a few different reasons. Maybe we can get into that a little bit later. But in terms of my day to day, it's a lot of it's producing research papers on specific aspects of policy, like drug policy, and trying to get those into the hands of politicians, regulators, people uh, who can change things in that particular arena. But there's also a very public facing aspect of our work as well. We do a lot of media work, TV, radio, newspapers. We do a lot of education work as well. So last week I was speaking to some university students via Zoom, obviously, and we do quite a lot of outreach to schools and universities as well. So it's a real interesting mix of different things coming together in one job. And specifically, each of us in the office, it's quite a small office, but there's only six of us now, I think. We all kind of specialize in a particular area. And when I first got in, drug policy was one of the ones I was already particularly interested in. And as you mentioned, other things like immigration, housing policy, sex work regulation as well, kind of broadly lifestyle issues and things related to social liberalism tend to be something I focus on more, whereas the others will tend to go for the more hard econ side of things.
Cool. Well, yeah, I think it's a very interesting area, and drug policy in particular is something I've been uh, rather fascinated by. As I've kind of mentioned on a stream before, I'm a sort of recovering libertarian, and one of the things that originally got me into libertarianism was this kind of realization that the war on drugs has failed and is very bad policy, and yet is enthusiastically supported by successive governments of all political stripes. And while I've gone back on some of the kind of economic views that I don't fully understand or don't necessarily endorse anymore, I still think that I've always been right about drug policy and that it's just causing a hell of a lot of damage. Um, Fortunately, however, it seems that change might be in the air with the recent demonstrations in the US, and generally in the US, I think a fairly steady improvement in the situation, at least on a kind of within certain states. So I guess, well, I guess first I'd like to ask you, 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, sort of recent past, where did you think we would be now in terms of like development of drug policy,
Yeah,
and
so that
how does it
in kind
measure
of
up with your expectations? So, I guess I'm asking.
sure. So I think people who really focus on drug policy tend to very often and have done for quite some time predict that in the next X years, say cannabis will be legalized is the classic one. And I think it was probably no different. 5 years ago when I was interested in these things. 10 years ago,
No, yeah,
I
you're
was a
15.
teenager then. Yeah, 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 exactly. Very interested in drug policy when I was 15. Um, but yeah, I think it's a difficult one because I kind of feel like that now, and I'm conscious that I don't want to be one of those drug policy people who's like, it's just around the corner, it's
Yeah.
just around the corner, like we've been saying for so long. But I think there are a few reasons, certainly for the UK and the US and many other countries as well. There has been movement, right? So
Mm.
it's been in the past 10 years that we've seen the first national cannabis legalizations and state cannabis legalizations actually take place for recreational use, at least. So that's something that's kind of marks out the past 10 years as being different from all that time before. Uh, in terms of public attitudes as well, I think this is something that if you look at the polling, certainly in the UK and the US for that matter, it seems as though there's been a real shift in this. I mean, we looked at pretty high quality polling for I think it was a YouGov and Ipsos Mori from a couple of years ago, and these have been commissioned fairly regularly on the specific issue of cannabis rather than drug policy more broadly. And public attitudes have massively shifted. So we now have majority of the UK public in favour of recreational legalisation. And if you split that by party, you find, unsurprisingly, Lib Dems are vast majority pro, Labour slightly less, but still majority pro. And Conservatives, surprisingly, are actually split down the middle if you look at Conservative membership
Interesting.
on recreational cannabis legalization. This kind of surprised me when I first looked at it because I thought that, oh, I'm pessimistic. Of course, the kind of membership, at least to the Conservatives,
Yeah.
are going to be pretty anti this. But it seems like across the board, amongst all age groups, especially younger people, there's been a significant shift in the past 5 years towards more liberal attitudes towards drug policy. In the US, it seems fairly similar as well. We've seeing similar trends kind of gradually creeping up in support. And in terms of the kind of, I guess, what the mainstream political parties have been saying about this. Well, again, you've got the Lib Dems having an active policy of cannabis legalization. Their mayoral candidate in London, Siobhan Benita, has campaigned on the idea of trialing cannabis legalization in London for recreational use. And then you've got Labour have kind of made strides on this fairly recently. David Lammy has played a fairly key role in this, working with organisations like VoltFast, which is another drug policy reform organisation that we've worked quite closely with. And they've got to the stage of calling for that Royal Commission on drug policy more broadly, which leaves a lot of different options open and kind of, at the very least, opens up the space to have that conversation in a slightly less politicised way.
What was that organisation's name? Sorry.
VoltFast, they've been around for a few years, and we've done a couple of papers with them on drug policy, and they do some great work. Kind of not because they're just focused on drug policy; they focus on a lot of issues that we wouldn't have the bandwidth to do. So, for example, they did a great report looking at drug dealing on social media and kind of lifting the lid on that, and how people tend to get drugs nowadays, and various other topics they've covered as well that we kind of getting into the issue in a bit more depth rather than our more higher level policy takes. They're looking at some of the specifics. They're really good. I definitely check them out.
How do you spell that? Because I've just googled it and I'm only finding
Oh yeah,
drugs, different
yeah,
type
no
of drugs.
worries. So VOLTE face
Uh,
to kind of about turn.
I googled Volt Fast, which apparently is some formulation of diclofenac or something. No, this looks
Well, broadly on target at least.
similar, similar.
Similar sphere.
Cool. That looks really interesting. So yeah, I guess where do you think we're headed, or where would you like to see us headed in the near future in terms of these kind of shifts in policy, whether on the kind of macro level of, the legal status of drugs in the UK, or on the more local kind of level?
Yeah, so obviously up till now I've just spoken about legal cannabis because that's kind of the hot button issue when it comes to drug policy at the moment. But there's plenty of other stuff that is eminently achievable in this field in a fairly short space of time. So putting aside the actual legal classification of currently illegal drugs more broadly, there's drug consumption rooms, which, if any of your viewers perhaps aren't familiar, is a kind of medically supervised space where people who are usually injecting drugs can go and have a safer experience when they use those drugs. So there's going to be clean needles on site. There's going to be trained nursing staff, for example, who are equipped to counter the effects of an overdose. They use a formulation called naloxone, which basically I've been trained to use it in some of my harm reduction work, and you kind of jab it into someone's thigh if they've taken an overdose and they don't die. So kind of basic harm reduction facilities here, and these things have been they're around the world. They're in Canada, they're in Australia, they're in many countries in Europe, and they've been operating for I think decades now in the case of some, and there's a very good evidence base that they work in terms of reducing overdose deaths, but also various other community benefits like reduced needle litter, less emergency call outs. When it comes to public health as well, you have reduced rates of HIV transmission,
Mm.
for example, which is especially a problem in certain drug using communities, needle sharing and such. And in the UK, at least, this debate's been kind of going on for a fair while now. It's centered on Glasgow specifically, although there are other cities like Bristol that are kind of looking at introducing one of these. And there's quite a broad range of cross-party support. So we released a paper on this. I think it was like last year. I think called "Room for Improvement," which kind of had an overview of some of the academic research on the effectiveness of drug consumption rooms. And when we released that, we got a kind of cross-party group. I think an MP, including crossbench lords as well, from every single party signed on to that. And there seems to be quite broad support for it. And the main kind of barrier to it at the moment is not something that's going to take 10, 20 years to kind of get around. It's basically the legal status of it. So the worry is that you'd have to kind of you'd be going against the Misuse of Drugs Act, basically the main piece of drug legislation in the UK that was passed in the 70s. And there are two ways that we kind of and that I see around this. The first is we already have stuff like festival drug testing, which also contravenes the Misuse of Drugs Act, where you go to a festival, if you have drugs on you and you get them through the security, then you can go to this facility that tests your drugs to make sure they are MDMA or they are ketamine, and they don't have loads of harmful adulterants in, and they don't the kind of dose that you think they are is actually what they are. So we have these sort of harm reduction services there.
Which
Uh,
it's worth noticing, note, noting even, is particularly important because the vast majority of deaths and serious adverse incidents that occur with ecstasy and drugs that are purportedly MDMA and other such party drugs are actually as a result of adulterants or different substances being labelled
yeah,
misleadingly. And yeah, so as with the drug injection sites, they seem like pretty obvious no-brainers in terms of harm reduction. Um, but
yeah,
as you're saying,
100%.
legislatively, that might not
Yeah,
be so easy.
no, it's not. But the way that the festival drug testing has got around the Misuse of Drugs Act is basically they've had kind of local agreements with the local police force for the festival site, the local NHS trust, and the actual festival organisers themselves. So it is possible to get these local agreements, and the thing that really allowed it is the Home Office put out a statement, effectively saying we're going to turn a blind eye to this, or we're not going to be, looking into this too much. It's up to local sites, and the same could be done for drug consumption rooms. The Home Office just literally needs to put out a statement saying, we won't be we won't be kind of intervening if one of these does happen to be piloted in, say, Glasgow or Hull or Bristol or other cities in the UK with quite high levels of problem drug use. The other way of doing it is the way that would take longer, and that's looking at amending the Misuse of Drugs Act, which is kind of, I think, what you want as an ideal goal. Not just because it allows you to do lots of other things relating to drug policy, but also because it would set up a kind of a framework for how these facilities would operate, and make it easier for people who provide them to kind of to know what they need to do to set one up and not be prosecuted. There's actually a guy that I've spoken to a couple of months ago called Peter Krykant, who is a former drug user from oh, if I get this wrong, he's going to come. I think he is from Glasgow originally. If he's from Edinburgh, I'm going to get
Yeah, that's
poetry for
a
that.
dangerous
Yeah,
one to get
the
wrong.
unforgivable sin. But yeah, so he is kind of pledged. This was pre COVID getting quite badly, so I'm not sure if this is still the case. But he's trying to set up a mobile version of a drug consumption room. I think my face is frozen now.
Yeah,
Can you
it's
still hear
frozen
me?
in a
Yeah,
delightful
there
pose.
we go. Let's stop. There we
Ah,
go.
there you go. Nice.
Yeah, that's a delightful expression there. Yeah, he's trying to set up a mobile version of these, and hopefully, he's going to hire out a van and have these various things on hand. So he's trying to do it in the civil disobedience way because there's been so many impediments to getting it set up in Glasgow, and there's some really strong kind of local SNP support. So the SNP MPs are very much the ones pushing for this in Parliament. Ronnie Cowan, in particular, is very good on this for them, and it's something that the government has at least signalled it could be open to. So this came up in PMQs a few months ago, and the kind of the only or the prime minister signalled, potentially, but my concern here is that would it encourage more people to use illegal drugs?
Mm,
Now, putting aside the fact that the level of use of drugs is not exactly the same as the level of harm being caused by drugs.
sure. Yeah.
Um, Even if you take that for granted, if you take that as true, there's some good research on this suggests that they don't. And to me, it makes fairly intuitive sense. If you're kind of there isn't many marginal, say, heroin users who wouldn't use heroin, and then actually I think I might start using heroin because there's the greater chance I won't die from an overdose. It's not quite the same. Like, I think it misunderstands why people would start to use certain drugs in many cases, at least. Obviously, I'm generalizing here, but
Yeah,
certainly
and
the evidence suggests that's not going to happen and not a concern.
certainly the work I've seen suggests that at least in the case of providing these kind of harm reduction methods, it doesn't seem to have an effect. We could imagine a plausible scenario in which heroin is provided in such a way that the harm is lowered enough, or at least the perceived harm is lowered enough that, some people on the margin will start using it. But yeah, in terms of the difference between being a severe, chronic heroin addict without injection rooms versus being one with injection rooms, there's not a strong positive incentive there to go, oh, well, I was having to inject on the streets before, so didn't really
Yeah.
make me want to do it. But now that there's a, sterile room, that's the thing that's going to push me over the edge too.
Yeah, it's not, you can't really portray it as a super attractive thing. It's like, oh, come on down, you're gonna,
Yeah,
inject some heroin. I mean, maybe, if you decorate it right, but yeah, it's not
it's
it's not likely.
yeah, exactly.
Not likely. And this is the same sort of, this is kind of symptomatic of a broader objection to more liberal drug policy that we kind of touched on before, which
Mm,
is this conflation between how many people are using drugs and how much versus the amount of harm being caused. I'd rather a world in which 20 people were using MDMA where they knew exactly how much they were taking. They were over the age of 18, for example. They had training in how to, drink water
yeah,
when they're on the sesh, various things like this, than I would where only 10 people using MDMA, but it was all cut up with crushed up malaria tablets, concrete, rat poison that they
yeah,
didn't know how
yeah,
much they were taking. Some of them are 14, 15. And that's the kind of reality of what we have at the moment, except, even then, I think the evidence for liberalization, in most cases, increasing use is fairly weak. And where it is, it tends to be in populations where it's far less of a concern. So
yeah,
if you look at cannabis, for example, whilst it's true that in, say, Canada and the US, you have seen moderate increases in adult use, and especially older adult use, so kind of 35 plus, you're seeing declines in teenage use. So there's a good study. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but there was a good one that came out in 2019. Let's have a look. The Association of Marijuana Laws with Teen Marijuana Use. Yeah, July 2019 study that found significant reductions in cannabis use in states that had legalized. And to me, that's kind of, classic argument from theory coming out in practice. Dealers don't ask for ID, whereas legal shops do. We have evidence from alcohol age restrictions that they do tend to reduce purchasing, even if you can technically ask someone to go in and buy it for you, they still provide some impediment. And the same seems to be true of cannabis as well.
Yeah, so consistent with results from previous researchers, there's no evidence that legalization of medical marijuana encourages marijuana use among youth. Moreover, the estimates reported in the table showed that marijuana use among youth may actually decline after legalization for recreational purposes. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, it's an area where we're going to need more research going forward, and it is a particularly useful facet of the US model of legalization of doing it in stages in different states, because it does very literally create a laboratory of democracy. You know, we
Mm,
do have the ability to control in a relatively, or to compare in a relatively controlled manner introduction of specific laws, and even across counties where you have some that legalize the sale and some where it's legal to possess but not to sell and all that sort of thing. It gives us a wealth of data. So while it's not necessarily the best thing for people's liberty, it can be useful, experimentally speaking.
yeah, definitely. Couldn't agree more, and the same's true in Canada as well, with the kind of the different provinces
Mm,
having very very different approaches to each other in lots of important areas. And I mean, this is something that it helps us not just to look at the effects of legalization versus status quo, but also the specifics of different regulations about how you actually end up legalizing cannabis. I mean, we were chatting before this started. It's something that we looked into quite a lot at a paper called The Green Light that we co-wrote with Voltfas, and we tried to, rather than simply make the case that legalization was a good idea, recreational legalization, that is. We also tried to look into, well, okay, let's try and find a blueprint for how we should best regulate legal cannabis if it was to be introduced in the UK, and let's see what other places have done and kind of learn from the mistakes that have already been made. And there's been an awful lot of mistakes that have been made. The kind of question of whether to legalize, to me, it's still more important than how we do it, but it's very very important how you do it. You can end up almost completely undermining the purposes of legalization,
yeah.
whatever they may be, whether it's public health, um, reducing underage use, eliminating the black market. Obviously, all of these things can really be screwed up by poor policy and poor regulatory decisions.
Yeah, I think I haven't been looking into this nearly as closely as you over the last few years, but I have seen several instances where it seems to be quite substantially screwed up by overtaxation or by not allowing anyone to actually set up stores in the places where people want to buy. And I guess there's a strong desire among conservative types or people wanting to appease the more conservative types. I mean, sort of small c conservative, um, in wanting to kind of tacitly admit that these substances are inherently dangerous and
Mm.
need to be controlled in very specific ways, as opposed to the kind of general controls that we put on, alcohol, tobacco, or other substances we want to regulate in some way. And well, it's like with a lot of U.S. counties where you do still get illegal alcohol trade, where they're still regulating the alcohol sale all these decades later from prohibition. There's always going to be unforeseen and often quite problematic side effects of heavily regulating this. And well, I guess that leads to the question: what regulations do we think are appropriate?
Yeah, I think that first off, he pointed out that there's this kind of this urge to treat uh, cannabis and other drugs as well. They're inherently dangerous. They need to be regulated very tightly, and that does come from small c conservatives. But what I found, the more I've kind of got involved in the general drug policy, drug reform movement, it tends to come a lot from people on the center left as well, who approach things not always, but often from the perspective of, well, we need to kind of treat this as a public health issue, which to an extent, obviously, it is, and it's important to have that dimension to it. But there's this kind of, I guess, public health way of looking at the world that I see, where, oh, if we just regulate this and we just limit the potency of that, and if we restrict licenses to here, then we can have control over this market, and we can make it as kind of beneficial as possible. And that's all very well kind of in theory, but of course, the free market insight here, and it's not just a free market insight, it's just a common sense insight, is there's often quite bad unintended consequences. So a few applied examples of this. I mean, Uruguay is kind of the classic go-to example of where a more heavily regulatory approach can go quite wrong. Canada as well to a certain extent, and some US states. But in Uruguay, you had this very state-centered approach to cannabis legalization, where it was the government that grew the cannabis, the government that sold the cannabis in dispensaries, and the problems with that. There's a few that were caused. The main one was shortages. So um, the classic kind of free market insight of government-run enterprises aren't very good at planning, and they're just not as efficient, etc. They're a monopoly with no competition, and they underproduced for a very large period of time. And of
Mm.
course, without enough legal cannabis on the market, that really undermined their efforts to get rid of the black market in cannabis. So that's one thing. But there's also uh, the dispensary side of things in Uruguay. You had, for a country as large as Uruguay, a very small number of dispensaries for recreational cannabis and medical cannabis being set up. And it stayed this way for some years. So I think at one stage, we're looking at maybe 10, 12 in the whole of Uruguay. The
Mm.
exact figure escapes me, but it wasn't many. And of course, in theory, it's like, right, we've got these shops, people will go to them instead because it's legal. But if you're someone who, the modern cannabis market can open up Snapchat, text your dealer, he'll be at your door, if he's a good dealer at least, he'll be at your door in 10, 15 minutes, or, you won't have to move a muscle. And there just wasn't that level of competition to the black market, or there just wasn't the quality of competition. And so people again remained on the black market. And we've seen this kind of to a lesser extent, but still significant in Canada, where the prices of legal cannabis are significantly above the going rate in the black market.
Mm.
And some US states, which say California, for example, started off when they legalized recreational cannabis with a much higher rate of tax that they then realized was screwing over their efforts to undermine the black market. So they ended up lowering it in
Yeah.
response, which, sensible
I think
enough.
Washington had a similar issue initially, at least.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not just kind of the level of tax; it's the way you tax cannabis as
Mm.
well that has lots of effects far down the line. So, if you tax weight, for example, then you're incentivizing higher THC strains of cannabis. That's a classic mistake rather than taxing by the value itself.
Yeah.
In terms of the things that we really focused on in the green light paper as important areas to consider with regulation, unsurprisingly, for a neoliberal swashbuckling free market think tank, private enterprise was a key one. It's the best way of addressing shortages. You get better access, so you're more able to effectively outcompete the black market. Um, the taxation side of things as well, for the same reasons, but also, and this is where we see perhaps more eye to eye with some of the drug reform organizations to the left, that a big focus on criminal justice reform being tied in with drug policy reform more broadly. So looking at things like expunging criminal convictions and criminal records that can screw over people's chances for their entire lives, whether it's access to housing or starting their own business. The idea that you should uh, you should ban people who have a drug offense from starting their own legal cannabis businesses, like, to me, completely absurd. Is these are exactly the sort of
Yeah.
people with the human capital that you want to transform from, quote unquote criminals to entrepreneurs,
Absolutely. Yeah.
operating in a legal market. And then again, another kind of area where we saw a bit more eye to eye was the public health aspect of it. Not so much the things like capping potency, which to me is an extremely bad idea. I mean, you look at
Mm.
the average THC strength in the UK market right now, it's hovering around 20%. If you suddenly cap potency at 10, 15%, like some organizations call for,
Yeah.
then again, you're going to completely screw over any attempts to undermine the black market. But more things around information. So Health Canada, the kind of Public Health England equivalent in Canada, they ended up having a kind of fact sheet that you'd have with every single cannabis purchase of, this is how you take cannabis, this is the potential of health effects we know about, here are the potential risks, etc. Here's how to take it more safely, just the kind of, the bare bones basics. And to
Yeah.
me, that seems especially, I mean, I guess Canada is quite a high, has quite a high prevalence of cannabis use anyway. So this information is probably known to a certain extent, but just to solidify that, I think is a good idea. Um, and also things around letting a certain amount of home grow take place as well. So there's a small, um, but but very active and very passionate kind of hobbyist community when it comes to cannabis, both
Mm.
in the UK but also elsewhere. And a lot of the time, they're very concerned that, well, if you have legalization, then it's going to kill their kind of small scale, cooperative or non for profit grows that that are already going on. An example of this in the UK is cannabis social clubs, and there's an organisation called UK Cannabis Social Clubs that are really good on various cannabis related issues, but just things like that. So expanding as much freedom for as many different uh, approaches to cannabis cultivation and retail as possible. I mean, online, for example, is another classic thing here. So some Canadian and some, I believe, some US states as well, but certainly some Canadian ones banned online sales, which to me again is just
Mm.
ridiculous. If you're out in the sticks, you've got your dealer 2 minutes down the road, you're going to go to them unless you can get
Absolutely.
it delivered to your door. It's a kind of Deliveroo or an Uber Eats for cannabis is something that, I mean, aside from being really really quite nice for consumer surplus, is it just makes sense from all these different objectives. So yeah, lots of different approaches. Not too crazy on the licensing either. I mean, you had a Canadian province. I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but it held a lottery for retail cannabis licenses with a set amount, which is again just crazy. You're not loads of people who might have really good business expertise and be able to actually meet that demand and undermine the black market. They're being prevented from doing so. You've got a lottery with very little specific criteria about being allowed to have the retail license. Like, I'm not a fan of licensing, but if you're going to have a licensing regime, then at least make it so that there's some kind of non-randomized criteria.
Yeah.
It's yeah, it
So
there's a lot of issues basically,
we've
but
got
we go into them all in a lot more detail in the green light, which is free online.
We've got a comment here saying, as is often the case, that aim to protect people ends up twisting because the people who most need protecting re drugs are probably not motivated, or not, probably not the most motivated people to seek out legal dispensaries. I think
Mm,
that's extremely true, and in both cases we're kind of talking about lowering the barrier to making the right choice from our perspective of whatever we
right.
think the right choice is. Um,
Yeah.
and I see a kind of parallel here with things like Netflix. So I don't know about you, but in my teens I used to pirate quite a lot of TV
No,
shows
no
and
comment. No
yeah,
comment.
of course, of course.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but I haven't really pirated anything in years, just because Netflix and Amazon Prime and I've realised we're on Twitch and Amazon sponsored, but Jeff Bezos not paying me. But these systems are just so much more convenient
yeah,
and not so expensive that they're not worth using. But if Netflix suddenly tripled in price and halved in bandwidth, then I'd probably go back to the torrent networks.
yeah.
Um,
I really like that parallel. That illustrates it so well. Just the kind of the effect uh, of business or big business or whatever coming in and professionalizing something,
mm,
as long as it's not ridiculous in price, or you get that quality boost, you get that convenience boost, etc., then you are going to opt for that,
yeah.
if you're able to. And the comment about that came in, I think there's another aspect in which this applies as well. So it's how messing up your cannabis legalization can really harm the sort of more marginalized communities that have
Mm,
been affected most by the war on drugs. So I was chatting with a regulator from Massachusetts. They've got a kind of cannabis regulatory commission, and we are talking about racial equity programs that often come side by side with cannabis legalization.
yeah.
I think that they're broadly a good idea to try and make sure we involve the people that were most affected by the war on drugs in the new legal industry. But she made the point to me that actually one probably more effective than those equity programs, which kind of give business training, etc., and access, is just making it as easy as possible to get a license
Mm.
to get into that market. It's all very well, saying, right, we're going to try and get people of color into this legal market, but if someone used to be, say, a low-level cannabis dealer and they're not able to even get a kind of a first step on the rung of the
Yeah.
legal cannabis market, then they're not going to be helped out by it as much. So yeah, all of these things kind of, if you mess up regulation with it, I don't, it's kind of a wonky think tanky topic, but at the end of the day, it has really important consequences for the people that you are trying to help when you liberalize drug laws.
Well, I think it's a topic that's very much worth discussing now.
Yeah,
It kind of feels like there's a bit of an ongoing shift, as we discussed earlier. You know, the US has developed substantially, and you're talking about cannabis clubs. I believe there's similar kind of consumption clubs, albeit a bit more uh, officially tolerated in Spain.
yeah.
And then you've got, of course, coffee shops in the Netherlands, which aren't strictly legal, but they're kind of more tolerated still. Um, and the direction we seem to be going in is increased liberalization. But if we don't do it right, I think there's not only the risk of bad consequences, but also the risk of uh, a backlash and people claiming that the policy hasn't done what it should, and
Mm.
that further slowing um, removal of these criminal penalties.
Yeah, the backlash point you make is kind of reminds me of another key debate in drug policy, which is legalization versus
Mm.
decriminalization. And I've kind of changed my thinking a bit recently on this because I used to be very anti decrim as the main kind of policy to go for. I'm starting to shift more towards it now. But obviously the main contrast between legalization and decrim is you've got a kind of legal regulated market, including supply, under legalization, whereas you've got no possession penalties under decrim, but you still have an unregulated black market in
Yeah.
supply. So Portugal's a classic example. They decriminalized all drugs in 2001. Some really great consequences in terms of public health. So way less overdose deaths, way less HIV transmission. Lots of success in helping people who were struggling with drugs kind of get their lives back together, etc. So that aspect of decrim I think is good. The problem is that if you make decriminalization the kind of main focus um, of your drug campaigning is kind of an effective altruist point, I guess.
Mm.
The worry that I used to have and still do is you a end up poisoning the well against further reform when decrim doesn't do what it says, what people want from liberalization, in that you still have illegal, unregulated black market with all the crime and all of the public health issues that come with that. The other aspect is you're simply spending a lot of political capital doing something that is strictly inferior, I think, at least to legalization. And there's an opportunity cost to doing that. So you risk the public backlash, and you also risk um, spending time on something where you could have spent it on better, a better, more productive campaign.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I say I've kind of shifted a little bit on this recently is simply just looking at how a lot of cannabis reform was done in the states. So this kind of surprised me that often you had that decrim come first and then you had legalization. So it seems that rather than being an impediment to legalization, it's actually a kind of pipeline towards it. I'm still not totally convinced that that story holds, but it's something that, at least as a kind of mechanism to get to legalization and to have some incremental improvements in the short run, maybe isn't such a bad thing. I mean, it's certainly not bad when it comes to the local kind of decrim measures like festival drug testing, like drug consumption rooms.
Mm.
It's more the kind of nationwide policy that I'm concerned about, and why I'm a little worried that, say, Labour's focus on a royal commission, uh, and even some of the kind of more sympathetic conservative MPs that are in this sort of space, they may go towards decriminalisation, whereas actually, all of the really big benefits are likely to come from full legalisation.
Yeah, I guess that's a difficult one because in the States,
Mm.
I think there's, if I'm recalling correctly, there haven't been that many individual states that have gone from kind of nothing to decrim to legalization. But
Mm.
there has been a lot of movement with like some of them going to decrim and then some of them jumping to legalization, kind of patchy development. I suppose it's
Yeah,
how closely that can be mapped onto the UK situation with our, counties, but counties being less devolved than states, and so on and so forth.
yeah, definitely. I think like that's the key to seeing whether the story is true. I mean,
Mm,
I've only, it was pointed out to me by someone who works at VaultFast that this may be the case that in the US you had the pipeline from decrim to legalization, but I just haven't had the opportunity to look at whether that story is true on a
yeah,
kind of state level, or whether or not it's actually, different states have been decrimming and legalizing at different times, and of course whether that would apply to the UK situation.
yeah. Because I know there's, at the moment, it seems to be a bit of a patchwork, kind of lots of individual police like authorities in the UK are
Mhm.
kind of reining in enforcement or saying, okay, when going to deprioritize this, um, but there doesn't seem to be a kind of national strategy so far.
Yeah, there isn't, and this kind of is a conflicting one for me because on the one hand, I mean, I think this is a liberal principle. Some may call it a conservative one, but I quite like the rule of law as a basic idea
Mm,
of, it should apply equally whether you're in Essex or London or Manchester or Liverpool or wherever. But I'm also quite glad that kind of police forces in their local areas that have taken a less stringent approach to policing, I'm glad that they've done that. So
yeah.
there's potentially a conflict there. I mean, when I was at university in Durham, there was a kind of quite well publicized announcement from I can't remember his title, the chief of police there, to Americanize it. He basically said, if you're growing a couple of cannabis plants, then we're not going to bother prosecuting you or going after you. So
Yeah.
great stuff on the individual level, but there's definitely discrepancies in how it's enforced because there are still some police forces that will go quite hard even on simple possession. Although broadly the story about there not being a war on drugs when it comes to cannabis, in terms of enforcement at least, I think that has a certain amount of merit to it. I certainly
Mm.
don't agree with the conclusions that come from that we need to double down on enforcement because that's not going to work. We have very good evidence internationally that there's basically no relationship between the level of enforcement and overall levels of use. If we can't keep them out of prisons, out of our borders, out of schools, out of anywhere that should have quite strong safeguards, and how on earth we're going to keep it out of the country at large?
Yeah.
It's you know,
I would like to just inform listeners now that you had a very entertaining debate with Peter Hitchens on LBC. Would
yeah, it was a
recommend.
couple of years ago now, but that was especially fun. The story behind that is so I mean it was a kind of general cannabis debate. I think it was after the announcements on medical cannabis being reviewed in the wake of the Billy Caldwell case, the young boy with severe childhood epilepsy who
Mm,
couldn't get access to cannabinoid-based medications, and the discussion was on, yeah, should we go further and legalize recreational? And he talked for, and I counted this afterwards, or I calculated this afterwards. He talked for about three-quarters of the interview, compared to me and the presenter in the other quarter. And throughout the interview, he was complaining that he wasn't being allowed to speak. And it was just so frustrating because you make a point and you know exactly what's going to be said in these
mm,
debates as well. It's, well, the war on drugs has never really been tried in the UK. Okay, for cannabis, maybe. For other drugs, I don't think that's true at all. Either way, the implication of that is not we need to double down on our failure, it's we need to try something new. Then there's the classic Japan point as well.
yeah.
He often brings out, oh, Japan and South Korea are perfect examples of very strict approach to drug policy and they have low levels of use. Someone on a separate interview pointed out that, well, Japan has a very strong cultural bias
Mm,
against drug use. A sumo wrestler there a couple of years ago was caught smoking cannabis and basically publicly disgraced and
mm,
shunned from polite society. So there's a key difference there as well. And he responded by saying this was not racist but racialist. So, pointing out that cultural differences might have some sort of impact
Yeah, I
is
mean, this seems widely. My understanding is as well that in Japan, the official rates and the kind of survey-based rates of drug use are probably massively overestimating it due to this very strong taboo, which one can trace
yeah,
back, at least in part, to American demonization of amphetamines post World War II.
yeah.
Because
And the
the
amphetamine is kind of the drug of choice in
mm,
Japan. It's very different from from the UK, and there is like quite a significant amphetamine related issues in Japan. But yeah, you're
yeah,
certainly right. Like survey bias underestimating because of this very strict taboo around drug use is going to be an issue there. I mean, the Home Office themselves, they visited Japan and several other nations. I think Czech Republic was one as well when they were going down the decrim route to kind of compare these approaches. And their conclusion, I think this was 2014, was yeah, it doesn't seem that the enforcement has any sort of relationship to overall levels of use. And I think if I'm being completely honest, I think that that might be a bit strong. I think there
mm,
is probably just because drug use is has inelastic demand doesn't mean that there's no response to enforcement. I'm sure if you kind of set up a sort of dystopia where people were flogged and then thrown in prison for their entire lives for so much as looking at a spliff, then you
yeah.
probably could get overall levels of use down so much. But of course, you know, there are trade-offs here. They're quite
Yeah, I think China seems to have had some degree of, I don't want to say success, but
yeah,
you know, effect in that department. But they send people through re-education camps and in some cases conduct invasive neurosurgery on them against consent and like do some really
wow.
unpleasant things to
Yeah,
drug.
I wasn't
Yeah.
aware of the neurosurgery part of it. That's pretty.
Oh, the some of the ablation studies coming out of Japan, sorry, coming out of China.
Yeah,
That's a bit racialist. I think mixing those up. Some of the ablation studies are really concerning. They do a lot of work on patients and prisoners who, the
wow.
consent is not exactly clear or well
Yeah,
reported.
yeah, that sounds pretty dodgy. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. It's not something that I've come across before.
Yeah, including some work on the like looking at modulating nucleus accumbens for addiction, which like might be effective, but you know, neurosurgery without consent is ugh, not good.
Yeah, not ideal. Not
No.
ideal at all.
Um, so yeah, if Pete Hitchens really wants to send us down that route, then yeah, maybe we can get some kind of effect at reducing drug rates, at reducing drug use. But as you were saying, it probably makes more sense to look at overall harm rather than just how many people are using drugs as your single, output for these kind of policies.
Yeah, 100%. I guess the kind of the other drug policy issue that I
Mm,
mentioned briefly, because we've been over, you know, cannabis and drug consumption rooms. The one that we haven't spoken about that I'm particularly interested in, especially recently, is psychedelic drugs for medical applications. I
excellent.
mean,
Yeah, I was just about
putting
to bring this
aside,
up, so
oh, perfect. Oh,
let's
there you go.
let's go into it.
Good timing. Yeah. I guess putting aside the recreational debate or the decrim debate, if you
Mm,
Denver, for example, having the vote on magic mushroom decriminalization, I think that there's very good reasons to apply similar sort of legal regimes to psychedelic drugs as well. But the medical applications in the meantime, there's an emerging field of research that's very much pointing towards that being very effective. Specifically, you've got MDMA for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, with kind of a special focus on veterans as well. There's been recently in the US, it's been designated by the FDA as breakthrough therapy, which kind of loosens some regulatory restrictions around its research. So you've got that on the one hand, and then on the other, you've got the kind of the classical psychedelics. I mean, MDMA technically isn't a psychedelic, but they tend to be lumped in to
pathogenic.
one group. Yeah, and you've got things like LSD and psilocybin being used for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression. So where more traditional clinical options haven't worked, and if you're looking for kind of a potted guide to this, I can really recommend a film called Magic Medicine by Dartmouth Films, which follows one of these a fairly small stage, I think a second stage clinical trial of of psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, being used to treat treatment resistant depression at King's College, which is just down the road from me. And you know, I mean, it's really
Sick.
fascinating, really kind of emotive film as well.
Oh, I thought Carhart Harris was at Imperial.
Mhm. Oh, so yeah, so Robin's one of the people involved, but Dr. James Rucker from KCL
Ah,
is kind of
right.
looking at these trials. So it's quite a cool community of researchers that are looking at this stuff. And I guess that there's, to put it as simply as possible, there's been some quite high quality studies that have suggested that yeah, these are significantly effective, and certainly they warrant more research, further research. I'm not an expert in the specifics um, of the clinical trials on these, but
Could
TLDR, it seems like they could be really useful.
don't suppose you know any of them? Because I wouldn't mind getting one of these folks
Yeah,
onto
sure.
chat. Because
Yeah, 100%. I imagine James would be up for it. If not, Robin probably would as
yeah,
well.
that'd be fantastic. Because it's an area that I'm not intimately familiar with, but
Mhm.
I do keep somewhat up to date with the research, and my main criticism of it as a whole is that they don't have enough participants, but that's
Yeah.
a fact of funding and red tape rather than an inherent flaw with the research.
Yeah, definitely. The numbers are just they're so small, and
Mm,
as you say, there's a reason for that, and it's because of costs and bureaucracy, which is kind of what one of the issues that we're looking at in the next couple of months, or putting some focus on it. So at the moment, if you take psilocybin, for example, that's classed as Schedule Two.
mm,
Sorry, Schedule One, I should say, Schedule One. And Schedule One drugs officially have no recognized medical applications or value whatsoever,
yeah,
or no potential medical application. But, there's a debate about whether we should even have that designation. I think it's insane that we have
yeah.
a designation that says we haven't researched it, but we already know
That's
that
not
it
how
will never
science
ever.
works.
Yeah, exactly. It's very anti-scientific. But a
Especially
lot of
as some of the most toxic chemicals on Earth have very useful medical purposes. Botulinum toxin is among the very most toxic substances that we know of, and yet in extremely small doses it can be life-saving in people with various musculoskeletal
mm,
disorders. So like yeah, maybe we don't have medical uses right now, but assigning it to a whole category is that you can't study is oh, we've got a good point here from Amy. Main criticism with the studies is the huge difficulty blinding, which is
yes,
of course a big issue. When your drug is definitely going to have perceptual effects, it can be very difficult to restrict there. Though microdosing is a potential way to reduce that. Although of course microdoses tend to have less, excuse me, clinically relevant effects. So, but yeah,
yeah,
this
yeah, it's a good point. It is very hard to kind of successfully. I mean, a lot of these have been observational trials or
yeah,
clinical trials rather than your gold standard RCTs. But
yeah,
even then, if there's some evidence that's kind of quite very strongly pointing towards potential medical application, we should at least be able to have a look into that in more detail and be able to afford to do and devise research methods to get around these specific problems.
absolutely, yeah, and
And
particularly, I mean, I'm very much in favour of randomised controlled trials whenever we can, but I think there's a big danger in medical research, lots of areas of research. It's an ongoing debate in effective altruism about like global health interventions. That if we only focus on things that we can easily do a RCT for, we're going to miss out on a lot of value of things that aren't as easily quantifiable, but may well still have a very positive effect. So it's
Right.
definitely still worth doing the research.
I mean, it's classic, expected value, right?
Yeah.
You might have like an RCT which has a very high probability of being accurate, but a fairly modest payoff versus an observational trial that has a lower chance but a much higher payoff. I mean, yeah, it's a really good parallel actually with that the global health priorities debate in EA. In terms of the kind of what this actually means, this Schedule 1 designation,
Mm.
there's if you speak to any researchers in this field, they will roll their eyes if they hear this term because there's so many bureaucratic barriers to and financial burdens. You have to get license at every single stage of production. All stages of the supply chain and the clinical trial process require an application to the Home Office for rather stringent licenses about things like storage, even though we've never seen any theft of these sort of drugs from storage before. They cost a lot, but they also take a lot of time. This is the kind of the one that tends to get ignored or forgotten. Is
Mm.
that it's not just the financial resource; it's that you might have to wait up to a year for a license for the storage of psilocybin or something like that. And all of this is not just delaying the ongoing process, it's also putting people off from engaging in that process in the first
Yeah.
place. So you're slowing down existing research and you're disincentivizing additional research as well. So I'd certainly think we should move it to, say, Schedule 2, which has far less stringent requirements. And, the need for Schedule 1 in the first place to me is just, yeah, it's not valid.
Yeah, and I mean, I can personally attest that seeing this in lab work where an extra hoop to jump through, an extra bureaucratic hoop, can be so off-putting to wanting to follow that research direction.
Yeah.
Um, Especially if you've got alternative areas of study that you can do with uh, with far more effort. One of my regulars, Stanley Cake Lie, says he's here for the legalized cocaine 2020 stream. Well, you've come to the
Oh,
right
we can
one.
get onto that. Yeah.
Um, but I mean, I would unironically support the case for legalizing cocaine. But before we kind of uh, go off on that tangent, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it's it's worth just trying to reduce the burden on researchers a bit, because even if these weren't highly promising areas, there's the kind of general principle of you know, liberal scientific enlightenment of wanting to be able to engage in free inquiry, unconstrained by the kind of the petty limitations of poorly designed laws. But there's also the important factor that when we're talking about disorders like PTSD, OCD, depression, these are conditions that have a very serious effect on people's quality of life and
Yeah.
are unfortunately undertreated. Um, if we can find ways of addressing them, and particularly ways that, yeah, as Amy just says here, there's a lot of patients with inadequate treatment for depression who could really use the help. Um,
Hmm. Definitely.
and not only that, but these are potentially modalities that would enable us to give a single dose or a limited number of doses and then have a very long lasting effect, which could well end up being preferable to taking a pill every single day over a very long period of time.
Yeah, they're very very different kind of treatment regimes, I guess, compared to your more traditional antidepressants. The trials that are depicted in that Magic Medicine film that I mentioned.
Mm.
You have a guided trip basically on shrooms on psilocybin on clinical grade
Yeah,
psilocybin with a couple of a psychologist and a psychiatrist on hand, and then you go away for quite a significant amount of time, and you will have repeat treatment, but it's not that kind of pill a day
yeah,
um, sort of mentality. Yeah, I mean you're right as well in terms of the kind of quality of life impact of things like anxiety and depression, it is one of the biggest. I think it's the biggest mental illnesses, characterizing something like 20-21% of all quote unquote disabilities in
Mm.
the UK. And depression, anxiety, obviously leading the way in that. Or you compare that to something like cancer and cardiovascular disease, they account for about 15% or so. So it's certainly up there in terms of EA style priorities to look
Yeah,
at. If you've got a very promising novel class of treatments for this, then you're going to maximize that utility a hell of a lot better.
absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, I think they're pretty no-brainers in terms of areas to investigate more. Um, Now, I don't want to be overly bullish on these things. It's still early days. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done. Um, but we just can't do the research unless it's feasible for scientists to engage with these kind of compounds.
It does seem like there's starting to be some more mainstream pharma interest in psychedelics.
Oh, uh,
It's not
just quick fact from a depression researcher, Amy. Major depressive disorder is the second leading cause of disability worldwide, which
worldwide. Wow,
yeah, yeah,
there you go. Yeah,
so,
the real expert here.
yeah.
I'm remembering kind of parts of a parts of an article that we were writing, but um, yeah, I've lost my train of
Mm,
thought now.
sorry, yeah.
Oh yeah, so there are some kind of larger scale pharma companies that are
Mm,
starting to look into. I mean, there's one that I think is UK based. I'm not entirely sure, but they're manufacturing psilocybin capsules for use in research to GMP standards. So there is starting to be more of an influx of at least interest in this from the wider pharmaceutical market. I think it's just it's a question of getting that evidence base very solid
yeah.
before it's solid enough for nice, which is not obviously not easy.
Yeah, so I guess kind of circling back a bit to the the consumption rooms. I think we've talked a fair bit about psychedelics and about cannabis, but I always feel like cannabis is often seems to be used as a kind of a not wedge issue, a kind of entry issue to, you know, uh, uh, make the case. Okay, well, what if we just legalize this or decriminalize this, and then we can move a little bit closer. But I often like to make the case that the strongest reasons to legalize or decriminalize, drugs, isn't in the softer drugs, but it's in the harder drugs where we see
Mm,
more substantial harms. Um, Particularly in terms of you mentioned earlier HIV transmission, hepatitis, all kinds of necrotizing disorders, very unpleasant um, diseases, and though not as bad in terms of public health effects, things like cocaine and methamphetamine can be, in and of themselves, hugely damaging. Um, but so much of that harm comes from their very legality. And
this is the classic
yeah,
ecstasy is less dangerous than horse riding
yeah,
David Nutt quote, which I
it's
definitely
absolutely
agree with.
true. Yeah,
But yeah, I completely agree. I think in terms of what's going to give us the biggest gain in public health and well-being, in reducing drug-related crime, etc., it is definitely the harder drugs. I mean, you can make the case that, well, if you kind of take the worst case scenario for cannabis and mental health effects, which I certainly don't, then maybe you could have on par just because the prevalence is so high.
mm,
But yes, I share that view as well. And I mean, obviously, that's very different from politically and practically
of
what's the
course,
best
yeah,
route to that sort of reform. But it's kind of, for me, it's kind of has some parallels with the open borders debate as well. Is that you might be day to day arguing for lowering X restriction on
mm,
immigration and Y restriction, But unless you are able to, if someone says, okay, what's the end of this? What are you hoping to accomplish? And you have to say, well, open borders, and this is why I think open borders would be
Yeah,
justified. And the same sort of thing, if you're someone like me and like yourself who might be, pragmatically focusing on cannabis legalization, just because that's the first step, as
it's
it
the
were.
tractable option. Yeah,
Yeah, someone will ask you, should we legalize all drugs? And you have to be like, well, yeah, this is why. um, there's certainly been a lot less work done on kind of harder drugs, as it were.
mm,
MDMA slightly more so. The Beckley Foundation did a good kind of roadmap to legalizing MDMA ecstasy,
interesting.
and I believe, I'm not sure if they've done it yet, but I know Transform Drug Policy, Steve Rolls over there, he's either finishing or finished a book on how to legalize cocaine. Although I caveat that by saying Transform tend to be very much of that more. Um, I don't want to disparage them, but like pro regulation perspective,
Sure. Yeah.
quote unquote public health perspective.
Yeah.
So it's going to be obviously different from if I was to sit down and write a roadmap to cocaine legalization, what it would be. Um, but it does come into some difficulties because with cannabis, you can argue for capping potency and things like this,
Mm,
but by and large, I think most people that are broadly on side will be like, yeah, you could probably buy it in shops as opposed to out pharmacy only access or
yeah.
something. But when it gets to say powder cocaine, then you tend to have a lot more focus on, well, we need to have restricted access points. We need to have like certain amounts that you're allowed to get from those restricted access points. You might have to have a day of training on how to use cocaine more safely and things like this. I can see I can see why people would go for that.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, you know, maybe the trade-offs for regulation here are slightly different than they are with cannabis, just in terms of inherent harms, but they're not that different. Um, as you say, an awful lot of the harm from drugs comes from comes from the fact that they're illegal, and it might be true that okay, cocaine is intrinsically, as it were, more harmful than cannabis. But then you come down to kind of liberal principles, right? As long as someone is
Mm,
informed, broadly speaking, obviously that's arbitrary, but roughly informed about what they're taking. They're, an adult who's in full possession of their faculties, arbitrary criteria again, but,
sure. Sure.
we use these all the time.
The law uses them. We can
Well,
absolutely
yeah.
reasonably.
Yes, quite. Um, but yeah, like I'm very of the opinion that, well, if you know what you're doing, you know the risks, then go for it, mate. And I think sometimes the distinction isn't just because of the health harms. I think there's a certain distinction that people have when it comes to, okay, someone occasionally smoking a spliff can, I'm guessing here, but someone who's smoking a spliff can still have the good life, as it were. Like
Mm,
I see distinctions between virtue ethics and consequentialism in everything when they aren't there. Just as a preface, but I think this one might have some legs to it in that people don't see harder drugs as ever being able to be a kind of good component of
yeah.
someone's day-to-day life. I mean, I think that's wrong. I think that you can make a perfectly good kind of um, virtue ethicist case for, yeah, occasionally people go on the session, do MDMA, occasionally people do a line of cocaine at a party, and actually that does make their life more rich and fulfilling, and
Mm,
eudaimonia achieving, or whatever you want to,
sure. Sure.
however you want to term it. But it does seem to come, I think, more from that background. If you're like a hard consequentialist, as I am, and as I think you are, you certainly
Yeah.
used to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Good man. Uh,
Probably harder than I used to be. So yeah.
excellent stuff. But yeah, like I think it's way easier to make the case from a consequentialist perspective because you don't have to answer this additional question of, okay, right, but how can opium or something be part of a good life? I mean,
Yeah.
Rory Stewart probably has quite a good life.
Yeah,
Maybe not
I
too bad.
always find the kind of the drug criticism that kind of reminds me of cocaine seems to be, even when it's being used by like quote unquote like high status or like relatively kind of balanced individuals, it seems to be very much painted as this like dirty
Filthy.
secret. Yeah, filthy, exactly. Um,
Yeah.
and I mean, to some degree, that's justified from a kind of perspective of ethical consumption of cocaine. The fact that
Yeah.
currently it all comes from cartels who do horrible things, but that just goes back to the it would be less harmful if legal point.
Yeah, 100%. The ethical consumption one's an interesting one because you get a lot of generally pro drug people who will kind of reject this ethical consumption point, and I think they're being
Mm,
quite inconsistent. Like,
yeah.
yeah, the current demand for cocaine, I mean, and plenty of other drugs does make it, on the margin, I think, immoral to consume them depending on the circumstances. Obviously, if your friend has already bought it and offered it at a party, then you're not adding to
Yeah.
marginal demand,
Same
etc.
arguments around meat or something.
Right. I think they're valid,
Mm,
but I also, like you, I think kind of raise my eyebrow a little bit because most of the time those arguments come from people who are enabling that horrible, carnage in the first place. So
yeah.
the kind of classic middle class drug users trope that's often deployed by anti-drug people in the government and has been for the past decade, or much longer than
Mm,
that. Actually, there's plenty that goes back. And okay, sure, we can morally criticize the people that are using this in a similar sort of way as we would to say people who eat meat, such as myself.
yeah.
I am a moral failure in that regard, but I accept that. Uh, and they're the ones that are they're enabling this in the first place. But it does like it irks me when people will kind of try to deny this argument and say like, no, 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 it's entirely the fault of them. It's like, well, in terms of where we should be concentrating our efforts and our blameworthiness, sure, but you still don't deny the basic point that you are contributing the marginal demand to it. And until
Yeah.
there is a kind of, of course, there's no ethical consumption under late capitalism, but until there's an acceptably ethical, legal, regulated route without any sort of cartel violence involved and the sort of things that are funded by the proceeds from that, human trafficking, etc.,
Yeah.
then yeah, you got to take some responsibility for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not saying I would be a regular cocaine user without it, but it is something that I think one should, as a informed consumer, be aware of. And um, I read a thing on, I think probably Vice, not that long ago.
It's always vice
Yeah, I
with
know,
us.
right?
Yeah,
About people on the dark net advertising like fair trade cocaine and
yeah,
all this sort of
100%. Yeah,
marketing.
I was going to bring up the dark web myself. Exactly the same point. The dark web has, I mean, whether or not I mean, there are kind of trustworthiness
Mm,
mechanisms that work quite effectively. But something like whether it's ethically sourced is probably harder to provide a trustworthiness mechanism for than simply getting your product delivered like they
yeah,
already have.
yeah.
Maybe it's possible. I don't know. I mean, it needs to have some sort of dark web certification and some sort of independent dark web body that's trusted. The Dark Web Fair Trade Cocaine Organization.
Well, I know. I think on some of the like dark web forums, they've got trusted users who will do like chemical analysis to check that
Yeah,
the potency is correct and
yeah,
whatnot.
that's true. I mean, there's like a thriving harm reduction initiative in the dark web drug market
Mm,
community. You go on any of them and you see like reagent tests for MDMA, for example.
yeah,
It's surprisingly good, and the studies that have been done on things like purity, for example, and matching the purity label by the seller, it tends to be significantly increased accuracy when compared with street bought drugs as well. It's just it's a shame. I can imagine a wonderful world of Amazon, but for drugs.
yeah. Oh, I would of course currently never buy anything on there because I abide by the Twitch terms of service. But if it were legal.
Good man.
Um, But I think there's also an interesting conversation we had. Jay Tibbs, one of my regulars, brings up the question of modafinil and
Mm,
similar like cognition and performance enhancing drugs. Um, And I think there's a few interesting topics around there. First of all, there's the kind of uh, moralization that we were just discussing, where you get a lot of people, I think, being very down on the use of performance enhancing drugs in
Yeah.
like non-competition circumstances, which
Mm-hmm.
always strikes me as very
That cup of
weird.
coffee in the morning. I
Yeah,
know.
right. I know.
Yeah, it's a really interesting. I mean, I'm not sure. Does modafinil count as against the Twitch terms of service? Do you reckon?
Let's as long as
Let's
we're
assume
not
it does.
actively encouraging use, I think we're
Okay.
probably all right.
Yeah. So I have come across, shall we say,
Mm,
modafinil before, and kind of was interested in the nootropics community. I got at it through, I
yeah.
think it was Slate Star Codex. No, it was Gwern initially, and
All
then
right. Yeah.
discovered the subreddit, etc. Um, Not particularly involved now, but certainly during university, it was an interest of mine, and
Yeah. Yeah.
it is one of those things where you get into this broader debate that focuses on, should you be using X drug in the Olympics and stuff like this. The moral issues around it are really interesting. There's you may know him, I think Julian Savulescu at Oxford. He
Yeah.
does a
He's
lot of
actually one of
work.
my supervisors.
Hey,
Yeah.
hey, lucky you,
I
because
know.
he
I know.
has, yeah, he's done some great work on this, and specifically um, relating to the kind of issue of whether trans athletes should or intersex athletes should
Mm.
compete in sanctioned sports events and stuff like that. I really enjoyed his work on that too. But yeah, there is definitely a stigma around them. I'm not sure. I guess it comes from, oh, you're getting an unfair advantage, etc.
Mm.
For me, the solution to that is very simple. In the same way that we should have performance enhancing drugs allowed Olympics, we should have less restrictions as a broad social rule
I've
when it
been
comes
arguing this for so long. I really want a,
oh yeah,
no limits. Give them all the cyber legs and, rocket feet or whatever they want. Pump them full of any of the chemicals they're willing to tolerate,
right.
and
Aside from
then
anything, it'd be more fun to watch as well.
exactly, exactly. And then do the other one where, they can't use any modern materials in their running shoes. They've got to run on sand and only eat like barley and apples because they can't have nutritionally
The
balanced
Luddite
diets. Yeah,
Olympics, I love it.
exactly, exactly. Go back to the old Greek days,
Yeah,
because ultimately everything that athletes are doing with training in hyperbaric chambers and optimizing their nutrition and all of
right.
these kind of things, it's using technology to enhance your physiology, which is fine.
Yeah,
That's
like
cool.
I get, there's if you want to set arbitrary criteria, then set them. But these
Sure,
ones
sure.
do feel very, very arbitrary in terms of that there is no clear kind of line between,
Mm.
you know, other than, oh, this is socially accepted and a normal habit versus this is not, which is hardly for me the best way to judge it.
Ooh, this is an interesting question from Jay Tibbs. What happens to all the factory workers in third world countries if you legalize drugs? Will they be worse off if nothing is done in conjunction? So I think that's the idea of, will they be coerced into using amphetamines all day to improve output and things like that?
I mean, there's two aspects I see to this question. The
Mm,
first is the kind of the implications of drug liberalization on developing countries, and the second is more of the kind of dystopian. Well, if we have a less prohibition of performance enhancing drugs, then yeah,
mm,
everyone will be force pumped. I mean, I don't know if on the second question, I don't know if the kind of acceptance of these drugs is going to, I mean, if a government's authoritarian, it's authoritarian, right? Like, I'm not sure it's going to increase its net authoritarianism, but it might be a kind of another manifestation of that
mm.
authoritarianism. And there's
Interestingly, methamphetamine use is extremely high in North Korea.
yeah, right. Although cannabis is legal there as well, it's
Yeah, although I think they only get really
strangely.
shit stuff.
Yeah, that's what I've heard as well. You don't smoke a joint. North Korean Cali Kush is just not it's not worthwhile. Yeah, I honestly haven't thought about the kind of, and it's a really interesting question, the kind of political ramifications of study drugs or performance
Mm,
enhancing drugs being more widely available. Um, I can imagine in some ways. I mean, if there was sufficient access, then it would potentially help to reduce sort of exploitation opportunities in the sense of people who maybe through their circumstances did not have as much say, willpower at the end of the day or something like that. I mean, if I'm doing a crappy factory 9 to 5 job, I get home and I'm absolutely knackered and I don't want to do anything. I want to put my feet up. That's certainly how I felt when I worked in a pub over the
Mm.
summer at uni. I was just washing dishes all day, and then I got to the end of the day. I just wanted to collapse and not bother doing anything. If I had modafinil there, then I'd get a hell of a lot more done in the evening. Um, so I mean, I'm not sure. I'm confident. I'm certainly not confident in the claim that it would reduce the kind of willpower gap or the however you want to phrase it.
Mm.
But I think in absolute terms, it would certainly help people who maybe didn't have as much time on their hands or as much energy at the end of the day to get on with other tasks that might help with their self improvement, broadly defined. Um,
I
but
would
also,
I would
but
also. Oh, sorry.
no, go for it. I was
I'm
done.
just saying I would also direct the audience in the direction of cognitive enhancement methods, ethics, regulatory challenges in science engineering ethics by Nick Bostrom and friend of the show Anders Sandberg. That's a very good sort of broad overview paper that discusses a lot of aspects of cognition enhancement, including pharmacological cognition enhancement, and deals with some of the sort of issues in justice and like fair appropriation or fair distribution of these technologies. Um,
That paper has been buried on my to read list for quite some time, and I'm glad you reminded me because
would
I'll give that a
recommend,
read after
yeah.
this.
Um,
on
and
on the kind of
yeah,
second
yeah,
aspect
yeah,
of
please.
the question, so there's there's two ways of looking at this. There's obviously, well, the people who are previously involved in, say, Bolivian cocoa production are going to be put out of their jobs because there's going to be domestic competition from the newly legalized market.
Mm.
Um, that could be true to a certain extent. That's a kind of, I mean, that's international free trade competition. That's the broader debate about whether you think that's good or bad on net. Obviously, I think it's good on net, but there's also the fact that there's already quite a lot of embedded human capital um, in these drug industries in the developing world. So, I mean, Bolivia, is a pretty good example of this, where there's a significant portion of their economy is based on cocoa production, um, and they've been doing it for quite some time, right? They've been at it for quite some time. They built up a lot of human capital in the agriculture involved,
Mm.
and also, in the illegal market sense, in transportation logistics, shall we
Sure,
say, and
yeah.
various other things about it. Now, that may not survive, uh, big business industrial
Yeah.
capitalism in the developed world. It may well do. I think it's probably quite difficult to speculate with any certainty on it. There's a broader kind of question of whether there should be some form of reparations as well when it comes to this. So, obviously, a lot of developing nations have borne the brunt in many cases of the negative impacts of drug criminalization. The
Yeah.
amount of cartel violence in somewhere like Mexico is still absolutely enormous, and that wreaks havoc on people's lives and causes an immense amount of misery.
I think
Um,
the drug war in Mexico has surpassed 100,000 deaths now, I believe,
yeah,
which
it's
is
insane numbers.
staggering. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really really, and I mean, even something as simple as medical cannabis legalization that significantly reduced organized cartel
Mm.
crime and violent crime, especially, and it reduced it the close to the kind of border, as it were. So that kind of the US states making that change really helped to start cutting into some of the profits of the cartels and reducing the associated violence. And you'd see a significant amount more when it comes to harder drugs as well. Uh, is my camera zooming in
It is
repeatedly? Is
slowly getting in. We're
Yeah, I
getting
don't know
more and
what's
more
going
intimate
on
with
there.
you.
Is that hello? I'll try and restart it. Any luck? Yeah, there we go. Back to a slightly less weird view. Um, yeah, I think that's probably covered that quite. Yeah, good question though.
Cool. And yeah, I'm just seeing several people in chat now bringing up the point that basically sort of fairness is really arbitrary in this when we're talking about real world problems,
Yeah.
and in sports uh, it's basketball players are 6'8". That's not fair to short people. I don't think sports should really even be about fairness. It's about finding the alpha chimp or a group of chimps. Um,
Right, like what's the so what's the not social purpose, but what's the kind of criteria for sport? What are we
yeah,
enjoying it for? We're not enjoying it if if not many people watch amateur football games for fun, right?
yeah,
Like, there's,
yeah,
I mean, aside from the marketing and stuff, it's the skill, and I want to see people run at 50 miles an hour, jacked off their head on whatever
absolutely.
pinnacle of human achievement.
Um, but of course, in some areas, where there's a lot of competition, but in kind of real world scenarios, we can potentially see the possibility of students overusing study drugs because they're in a drive to compete, even though it's not actually a zero sum game. There is sort of perception of some games as being zero sum when they're not.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess the more libertarian worry that I have about this is that I broadly accept the signaling model of education,
Mm,
and actually, are you risking, um, a lot of, are you risking potential misuse of study drugs or overuse and the negative consequences of that for very little human capital gain, right? Like, you're, it's not as like you're just or you're broadly improving your signal of intelligence or work ethic or whatever, but you're not, you know, in that sense, it is kind of zero sum.
yeah.
Obviously, that's a very much debatable point whether you accept the signaling model of education, but it's one that kind of specifically for free marketeers and libertarians, you buy that, it might be one to worry about.
So actually, that brings up a somewhat tangential thing. Is why are you guys calling yourselves neoliberal rather than libertarian these days?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I mean, the kind of the key difference that we see and the reason why it originally happened. So my former colleague Sam Bowman, who kind of initiated this name change, along with our former head of research Ben Southwood, and they kind of saw the UK in the UK at least, libertarian tended to mean a kind of the more socially conservative, very small state, natural rights based deontological sort, rather than the sort that I am and that they are. So kind of broad philosophy differences is kind of we want to signal that we're consequentialist, but when it
Mm.
comes to the specifics and how that applies, that means things like we're comfortable with redistribution in principle. So we've written in support of UBI or negative income tax, etc. Just taking trying to it sounds like kind of nuanced trolling, but
Mm.
trying to be more practical and empirical, I guess, and where the evidence supports departing from the general free market small state view, then we follow that evidence and we just
Mm,
take
cool.
that as well. Yeah. So that's the kind of if you're interested in the specifics, Sam, when he initially announced this, wrote a piece called "I'm a Neoliberal, Maybe You Are Too," that kind of goes
Oh, I
through some
remember
of the
that. Yeah.
yeah, I think that spells it out quite well. I mean, since then, there's kind of been a, as with all political movements, a schism. Uh, the People's Front of Judea stuff, and he found that in the US, there's been a kind of some ways linked, some ways running parallel, a neoliberal movement that's growing there, and that tends to be coming more from the kind of centre left. Not exclusively. There's certainly some, centre right neoliberals in the US,
Mm.
but there does seem to be this split across the Atlantic between, you know, people who might be broadly supportive of, say, Elizabeth Warren, or were broadly supportive of Elizabeth Warren because she portrayed herself as a technocrat and a policy wonk, and that counts as neoliberal. Whereas the kind of more UK-based neoliberalism is like, I'm not actually sure about that. Some of her policies maybe not such a great idea. So there's definitely a kind of like liberalism itself.
Mm.
There's there's different strands, there's core and periphery ideas and stuff, but things that are pretty similar or pretty shared, things like YIMBY movements, you know, build tarmac the green belt, etc.
Hell yeah.
All that good stuff. Social wise, I think there's broad kind of consensus around, the hot button issues. So we tend to be, pro trans rights. We're certainly very pro immigration. That's another one that is
Mm.
very well characterized as everyone. But the the extent to which we support kind of the market economy and free market economy differs. Although I don't think there's any kind of Bernie supporters, for example, who call themselves neoliberal, or no former Corbyn supporters who would call
Yeah.
themselves neoliberal.
I assume the Adam Smith Institute is riding with Biden.
That's a good question, actually. I am. I'm not sure about my colleagues though. I think they probably
Yeah,
all.
I
I
hope
know a
so.
few of them definitely are. The this real good example of the schism though. There was a kind of massive Twitter fallout when Sam declared that he'd prefer Trump to Bernie in the US elections, and
Oh
that's
yeah.
something that really kind of brought out the brought out the two sides quite clearly. But yeah, we're riding with Biden.
I often find myself kind of in the middle of the two because I've come
Yeah,
from more of a right perspective, but now most of the people I socialize with are more on the left, so I'm kind of I'm in that. I'm
stuck in the middle.
yeah, I'm liberalish, like, and it varies on the issue. Like,
Yeah,
the left neolibs often want to do all the sugar taxes and so forth, and I'm like, I mean, it might
yeah.
reduce consumption, but is that the only thing we really want to optimize for?
Yeah, I like Lucozade with a hangover. I quite like the old iron brew. My consumer surplus matters, damn it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, we were going over it briefly before all this, but I'm type 1 diabetic, and I like my medicine not costing absurd amounts.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, Neon Golden in chat asks, does Sam still feel the same way? I guess re the Trump Sanders thing.
I think he does. I think he's. I'm not sure that you have to ask him,
Yeah,
but I'm pretty
yeah.
sure he's prefers Biden. In fact, no, he definitely does prefer Biden to Trump. Like it, I think his ranking was something like Biden. Um, I can't remember who else. Trump was somewhere. I think it was Trump actually being higher than Elizabeth Warren and Sanders. But I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, just give him a tweet and ask him.
There you go. There you go, Omi. Send him a tweet and you'll find out. Cool. Um, okay, right. I think we'll kind of move towards wrapping up there. But if you
Sure thing.
have anything you'd like to plug or shout about or whatever, please feel free.
Yeah, sure. So we've got a paper on the psychedelics issue and the regulation around that coming out fairly soon. We don't have
Awesome.
a specific date for it because COVID is great.
Yeah.
But yeah, just keep an eye out. Our website is adamsmith.org. Our Twitter handle is at ASI, so nice and easy to remember. And yeah, follow our work, and we're holding webinars every single week on lots of different topics, which are very fun. We've got one tomorrow on the causes of innovation with a friend of ours,
Ooh.
Anton Howes, who's really interesting. He's written a book on, well, he's written I think a couple now. One on the history of the Royal Society, and one on the kind of history of invention in the Industrial Revolution. But he's a very cool dude, and I think yourself and your viewers would really enjoy that webinar.
That sounds very interesting. What time is that?
It is 6 till 7. He's being interviewed by our president, Manson Biri.
Ooh. I will put that in my diary 'cause that does sound good.
Nice.
Well,
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on this one.
oh,
It's
thank you
been
for
really,
coming.
really great chat. Nice, and I like how not laid back, but yeah, how laid back it's been. It's
Yeah,
nice to be able to
that's
kind of go off on tangents and stuff. Like when we
that's
were
what I'm going for. Yeah.
chatting earlier about how we both like the 80,000 hours podcast. I think
Mm.
that the high length, not too much set sections is great fun.
Yeah, exactly. I like to go with, you know, 4 or 5 questions maybe that I've got planned out, and then I'll kind of ask three of them over the course of the interview, and beyond that, we'll just like have a
Meander.
conversation. Yeah, meander, exactly. Well, yeah, thank you very much for coming on. If you'd like to coming on again in the future to chat about like immigration or something, I'd love to do that as well.
Yeah, that'd be
Um,
awesome.
And yeah, well, please everyone do visit the Adam Smith Institute. They put out a lot of good policy stuff. Also, Daniel Pryor with two R's at the end is Dan's Twitter. And yeah, thanks very much, man.
Thanks a lot,
Take
Lauren.
it easy.
Cheers.
Have
Been
a good
great.
evening. Bye. There we go. Right. That was Dan Pryor. He is, like I say, old friend and particularly interesting chap. And I hope you all enjoyed. So I'm gonna bugger off now, but thank you once again to J Tibbs and Stanley Cake Lie for some great commenting, and of course to uh, wonderful Neon Golden. If you would like to see a chat between me and Neon Golden, check back in my YouTube page or the Twitch page. It's the one about like reading a scientific paper for non-scientists. Really proud of that, and most of the credit goes to Amy, aka Neon Golden. Um, so yeah, I will go away, but I will be back on Wednesday when I'm chatting with Sudosia, who's another Twitch streamer, about the far future and what like exciting science fiction stuff we're going to encounter. And I'm particularly interested in talking about that because um, I speak a lot about existential risk on here, and while I think that's really important to discuss, the reason why is because I think that there's so much promise in the long-term future that it's extremely, extremely important not only to save the 7.8 billion people alive today, but to save the hundreds and hundreds of billions of potential future lives because the future could be really bright. We just need to get there. So, yeah, I'll be chatting that with Sudosia, which should be nice and upbeat. And then Friday, I'll be doing my usual, cocktail plus something else. Um, the shops near me have run out of ice, so I've started having to make my own in big batches, which maybe by Friday I'll have some of my new clear ice. I'll tell you about clear ice on Friday because that's a whole thing in cocktail making. But anyway, um, yeah, yeah, me and my ice. Also, in a couple of weeks, we'll have Anders Sandberg back on to continue our conversation about colonizing the universe. Um, Good old friend of the show, Anders, who I'm hopefully going to be working on a new paper with more details about that later. But yeah, thanks very much, everyone. Really, honestly, it's lovely having interested and interesting people in chat. And you have a good evening.